Today we're talking about God, science, and technology. Okay, and this is and this one I put this here because this is kind of at the intersection. We've been talking about kind of the defense of the faith, and we're going to be transitioning into applications of the faith, how we can actually use theology to really do things in life. And so science is a good one because it kind of mixes both of those things. There's a lot of anti-Christian ideas along with science, and then but also science can be informed by Christian theology in ways that we will see. So kind of for those of you who are Nacho Libre fans, so this is one of the characters, Nacho Libre. He likes to say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. And that's kind of, a lot of times this is this is kind of the mainstream culture. Even if they believe in God, a lot of people will say, well, science says this, and therefore theology has nothing to do with it. So just kind of this big separation between, if science says it, it must be true, no matter what theology says. So I want to start out by really talking about the relationship between science and faith and theology, because this is one place where I think there's a lot of confusion, and I think there's a lot of different ways that people interact with this, and it's good to know kind of the different options and where everyone's coming from. So I've kind of identified four main ways that people model the relationship between science and faith. The one that gets talked about the most, but it's probably not held by that many people, is the Warfare Thesis, which says that science and theology they're in a continual war against each other over the truth and how we know the truth. And so there's this idea that science, and so you have science on one side, you have theology on the other, and they're continually battling, and a win for one is a loss for the other, and they go back and forth. And so that's the Warfare Thesis. And then there's another one called non-overlapping Magisteria. And that says that science and theology are on two completely different sides. They're like in two different planets almost. They're completely talking about different things. And so there can't be a conflict between science and faith because they're really talking about very different subjects. There's another one called Non-Realism. And so this is basically saying that science and theology can't be in conflict because one or both of them, perhaps, aren't really talking about real underlying truth. They're both more talking about practical truths, practical ideas, practical wisdoms. So they can't really be in conflict if they're not really talking about the truth. We can have more than one practical way of looking at things. And so non-realism says that either whether it's science or whether it's theology or whether it's both of them, we're talking about things that aren't necessarily real, and therefore to talk about a conflict between them is kind of silly because they're just different viewpoints on the same thing. And the fourth one is Concordism. And that is when you understand them properly at their fullest level, faith and science will both be true and be in agreement. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail. So the warfare, all of these different ideas actually have some amount of stuff going for them. So the Warfare Thesis is correct that faith has additional methods for finding truth than science does. There are different ways of knowing in theology that are not available in science. And both theology and science make truth claims. So that means they actually can, at least in theory, be in conflict because they're both trying to make truth claims. But there's a lot of problems with the Warfare Thesis as well. First of all, very few people even claim to hold this. There's a lot of talk about the war between science and faith, but I have met hardly any Christian that views their faith as being at war with science. More often, you will find atheistic scientists who view science as being at war with Christianity, but you will very rarely find a Christian who thinks that Christianity is in war with science. Perhaps you'll find some that believe that Christianity is at war with some particular aspect of science, but rarely the enterprise altogether. Then you have the fact that there's many Christians that are scientists, so it's hard to say that there's a warfare if you have a lot of Christians that are participating. And then, as we'll talk about later, modern science actually came out of the Christian tradition. It's an outgrowth of Christian thought. Again, as we'll see later, modern science actually presupposes many of the basics of Christianity. And then science itself has conflicts and contradictions. So if you say that theology contradicts science, well, that's not quite so interesting when you recognize that there's a lot of science that contradicts other science. So just to say that, there's parts of these that are in tension with each other, well, that's true of all science. There's pieces of it that have not been fully integrated. There's different aspects of things that look that you have contradictory evidence for different ideas, and that just means that we're not done yet. So anyway, so being in tension is not necessarily even a problematic thing. And then additionally, having more methods of finding truth isn't really a problem unless you want to make it one. So there is, however, a fundamental conflict between faith and scientism. And scientism is the idea that only science can produce knowledge. And so there is a conflict between faith and scientism, because faith, as I said, it has additional ways of finding knowledge. And so if your belief is that science is the only way of attaining knowledge, well, then that actually will be in conflict with theology. So non-overlapping Magisteria, this is proposed by Stephen Jay Gould in his book Rock of Ages. And again, this is the idea that science and faith are just so radically different things that you don't have to worry about conflicts between them. So there's like a saying that kind of matches with this, that theology tells you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. This viewpoint is correct, that many of the claims of theology are completely outside the scope of what science studies, and many of the things that science studies are completely outside the scope of what theology studies. Those are both true statements. It's problematic, though, because it tries to place a limit both on science and faith as to what they can make claims about. And these two, science and faith, are both broad enough that they actually do wind up making claims on overlapping ideas. And so what this winds up being in practice, and you'll see this with people who really feel that this is the right way to go, is that most people who hold to this, what they really think is that anything that science says, we should agree with. And if there hasn't been a scientist who bothered to speak on this subject, then we can leave it to theology. So basically, basically the practical outgrowth of this is that science will grow bigger and bigger and bigger, and theology will go smaller and smaller and smaller until it doesn't even exist. So then there's non-realism. And non-realism, it's correct that what science is really able to study is equations and data. And so when we make inferences from equations to what is really there, that's actually a philosophical move. It's not actually a scientific move. So when we say, when we ask what is gravity, the law of gravity, the equation behind gravity, is something that science studies. But why that equation works is actually more a matter of philosophy. And so you could think of that as science not actually talking about reality, because we don't know, science doesn't actually tell us what all of the pieces of the equations mean. But nonetheless, I really think that scientists, when they're working, they really are trying to get at what is the underlying truth. And then, so everything that we think about, we actually interpret through a set of preconceived models. And those models aren't entirely accurate. Truth is difficult. It's difficult to really find and establish firm truths. I think sometimes we take, we do know a lot of truths, and so sometimes we take the difficulty of apprehending truth too lightly. And then it is also true that God may have, people say, well, when God's talking in the scripture about creation and things like that, that he's talking baby talk to us. So, and so the idea is that we shouldn't take those things too literally because they were just for our understanding at the time. And it's true that God may have talked baby talk to us in scripture. But the fact is that even baby talk has reality behind it. And so to completely disregard something because it might have been put into words that are more simpler than what the underlying reality is, I think is too glib of an approach. So no matter how tenuous our perceptions are, it's our goal to know the truth. So whether you're approaching it through science or theology, it's really our goal to know the truth. And so even though it's, truth is hard, it takes a lot of work, it's not always as solid as we hope it to be, it is really our goal to find truth. That's what we're looking for. And so finally, there's concordism. And concordism is correct that the participants in science and theology both want to know the truth, and that if both parties have apprehended the full truth about something, they will have apprehended the same thing. So if theology gets at the truth and science gets at the truth, then because reality, there's one truth, they will have gotten the same thing. Additionally, many times the things that theologians are interested in and the things that scientists are interested in, they do overlap. And then, what often happens in science is that if you know a truth in more than one way, we actually view that as having additional evidence. That's really good evidence that a theory is true if it's true from more than one model of justification. If I can justify a theory in two completely different ways, well, that's actually really good evidence that it's true. And so if something can be justified both from science and theology, that would actually lend more credibility to the idea. The problem that you have in concordism is that we oftentimes assume that modern theology and modern science are both at their highest level, and so either one or both could be in their infancy. And so now I'll talk a lot about the development of theology and where we're at in theology. When I talk about the development of theology, I don't mean that we're changing out our core doctrines. We've said the Apostles' Creed since the beginning. Those things aren't changing, but there are a lot of aspects of things that do change in theology. There's the theology of what exactly is the relationship between the body, the soul, and the spirit. There's a lot of things in theology that actually do change over time. As we investigate further, we try to learn from the Bible. We try to learn from experience. We try to learn from reason. We try to learn from science and try to, there actually is a development of theology, not on the core doctrines, but on a lot of the outgrowths of those doctrines. So, we often presume that what we know right now is, we know awesome science and awesome theology, but it could be that both of them are at their infancy. And so if we try to bring them together too quickly, that will kind of make false steps. And so additionally, what happens a lot of times is that many times people who are trying to find these concordisms between science and theology, they'll take, they find something that matches between the two, and they'll take that as being equivalent with Scripture itself. And that's a problem. And so my own view is what I call weak concordism. And that is science and theology are both looking towards truth, but any given idea might be underdeveloped. And it might even be too underdeveloped to relate from science to theology or from theology to science. The goal of harmonization is good, but we should never view any particular harmonization as being definitive, as being on the level of God's word. I don't think that we should be particularly concerned when evidences or theories from are at odds between science and theology, simply because neither field is fully developed. I also am not sure that science has all of the tools that it needs to understand reality completely. So, looking at reality from an incomplete viewpoint could lead to wrong answers. And then I also think that the intersection between science and theology should be viewed just like any other interdisciplinary effort. Sometimes there's a interdisciplinary effort between engineering and science, or between optics and mechanics, and there's just a lot of different fields that there's interdisciplinary efforts where they try to see how they can help each other out, and I think that's good for science and theology. And as I mentioned before, it's always considered strong evidence for a proposition if you can justify it in two different ways. And so if we can justify something from science and theology, I think that actually lends a lot of support for it. So those are the broad brushstrokes of how theology and science interrelate. But what a lot of people don't understand is that Christianity actually came out, or science actually came out of Christianity. And this history is not really well known. Now, in the broadest terms, we've actually had science around since antiquity. There's been developments in math, there's been developments in mechanics. The Archimedes did a bunch of amazing things, but science as we know it today as a field of enterprise actually originated after the Middle Ages in Western Europe. And the characteristics of the science as an enterprise, so there's a focus on the avoidance of self-deceit, right? Because the idea is the person who's easiest to fool is yourself. And so we're trying to find ways to avoid deceiving ourselves. Focus on the importance of universal laws, things that are true everywhere. Focus on the importance of experiment, that we can't just know everything through reason alone. We actually have to look out into the world and try things out and see if they work. And then focus on the public nature of science, the fact that the data needs to be public, it needs to be repeatable by anyone. These are all important things of science. Now, the thing is that a lot of these things came out of Christianity. So the focus on the avoidance of self-deceit, well, that's a recognition of the sinfulness and fallenness of humans. We're all fallen, and so that's why we tend to fool ourselves, is because we're not perfect beings. We have to take our fallenness into account. The importance of universal laws comes from the fact that reality issues from a universal lawgiver. If you imagine the viewpoint of the Greeks, you have all these different gods that are over different things, and they're all kind of capricious. And so this understanding about this universal set of laws was not understandable, at least to the public at large. Then there's the focus on the importance of experiment. And this is the recognition that God had the freedom to make reality however he wanted. And so therefore, we can't just infer everything from logic alone. We actually have to go out and look. We have to go out and see the way that God created. So one of the problems, for example, Aristotle tried to determine everything based on reason and logic alone. And this led to a lot of problems because you can't determine everything from reason and logic alone. You have to go and look. And Christians recognize this because we recognize that God was free to create in any way that he chose. And then there's the focus on the public nature and repeatability of science. So this is, Christians viewed God's work as important, that knowing his work is important, proclaiming his work is important, and then all people are dignified, and they're dignified to share in that understanding. So science should be public, should be part of what we all share in a knowledge of God. And finally, again, you need it to be public and repeatable because of the sinfulness of humans. If I just allow some person over there to do all the science and tell me about it, well, I'm over relying on their benevolence. And so the fact that we need public documents, we need repeatability, this comes from the Christian view of the fallenness of humans. In his book, The Genesis of Science, James Hannam said, the Christian God is reliable. He is not capricious like the Olympians of ancient Greece or entirely beyond human comprehension like Allah. Natural philosophers, which we call scientists, knew that they could depend on the laws that he had laid down. Nature itself should reflect her creator by obeying his commandments. This gave Christians good reason to believe that science was a practical venture and that nature did follow fixed laws that could be discovered. And actually, this is actually from an essay he wrote, but it's the same subject is covered in his book, The Genesis of Science. So also, science is incompatible with naturalism. So naturalism, the idea that nature is all there is, and there's a lot of people who are who believe that nature is all there is, and they think that Christianity is misguided. But actually, if you look deep into it, science is actually incompatible with naturalism. Because if naturalism is true, then there's no reason for us to trust our senses. And we can go to Charles Darwin for this. He says, but then with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? And so you see that, this the ability of humans to reason, to properly understand their environment, and to understand the underlying reality is actually dependent upon us having a orientation towards truth. And this actually has is not just Christians that say this. In the book, The Case Against Reality, Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes, Donald Hoffman presents the what he calls the fitness beats, I think it's the fitness beats reality theorem, and where he shows that on an evolutionary, based on evolutionary assumptions, that evolution will always it's fitness beats truth, that's what it is. Evolution will always optimize towards us being fit instead of us knowing truth, and that this happens reliably on the map, just based on the mathematics of evolution. So anyway, so this is also Alvin Plantinga, who's a Christian, has stated this in his book Where the Problem Really Lies, and he points out that if evolution is true, we don't have reason to trust our senses about the truth. And so if we don't have reasons to trust our senses about the truth, then we don't have reason even to believe in naturalism, because how else would we know about naturalism or evolution except by what we perceive through our senses? So theism provides the only context by which we have sufficient trust in our senses and our rationality to actually find the truth of the real world. And there's also, so, you might say, okay, well, if all this is true, why is there this widespread belief that science and faith are incompatible? And there's actually a lot of myths about the relationship between science and faith that have come down to us. And while there has indeed been some mishandling about this, about science and scientific inquiry by Christians, it's really the exception and not the rule. And most of the examples people point to, not only are they mythical in some senses, but they're also very old. I mean, Galileo was hundreds of years ago. The fact that people keep on bringing up Galileo indicates that nobody has a more modern example that they can point to. Making I make mistakes every day. So if some endeavor had to point back hundreds of years in order to find a really nefarious mistake, well, I'd say that's pretty good. But even so, a lot of the things that that people point to as problems are not there might have been problems there, but they aren't usually the problems that get brought up. I could do an entire lesson on Galileo because there's so many misconceptions over what happened with Galileo. In short, it was a political decision. His problem was that he made, he basically made direct critiques of the supreme ruler of the land and did it in an unfriendly fashion. He was actually paid by the church to write his book that discussed the heliocentric theory, he just decided in doing so that he would just poke in the eye the very people who were paying to have it written. Giordano Bruno was a heretic, and he was unfortunately burned for it at a time when that was, I wouldn't say it was a common practice, but it did happen. Many people say that he was burned for his scientific views, but that actually is not the case. It was for his theological views, and thankfully we don't burn people for either type of error these days. But some people think that this was a scientific problem, and it really wasn't. And then there's the Inquisition, and certainly there were a lot of problems in the Inquisition, but what most people don't realize is that the Inquisition actually started as an attempt to get rid of mob justice. What happened before the Inquisition was that, if people said something they didn't like, then a mob would show up at their door and beat them or worse. And so the Inquisition was set up in order to have a rational dialogue about this, to confront people, and basically was about due process. And so now there were excesses in the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was one where there was a lot of excesses, but by and large, you would actually have criminals who, when they were caught, would commit a heresy, so they would be brought before the Inquisition rather than the secular authorities. So anyway, a lot of these things, it's not that there weren't abuses, it's not that there weren't problems, but a lot of what people bring up as these big clashes between church and science are really not what people make them out to be. So there's also been a lot of science and technology advancements that are specifically based on theological reasoning. So not just the overarching view that, there's a law and a lawgiver, but there's also some very specific advances, and some of these are for very big areas of science that are specifically based on theology. And a lot of these are in the book Naturalism and its Alternatives in Scientific Methodologies, which it's somewhat of a technical book, but there's a lot of good stuff in it. So just kind of as a simple one, the dairy aisle. So if you go to a grocery store and you look in the dairy aisle, you'll find milk that has been pasteurized. You'll find cheese that has been pasteurized. Okay. Well, what is pasteurization? Well, so at the time of Louis Pasteur, or the other people at the time of Pasteur, believed that life regularly arose from non-life, and so that you might have meat would give rise to maggots, that you'd have this decaying material would grow things, and that these things would actually be spontaneously come into existence, so that life regularly came from non-life. Pasteur, however, believed that God was the only one that created life, and so that if you killed off all of the living organisms, then there would be you wouldn't have any living organisms pop into existence. And so pasteurization is the practical application of this theological stance. Because basically pasteurization, you heat up the dairy product to a point where it kills off most or all the organisms, and then you cool it back down, but you keep it sealed. And as long as you keep it sealed after heating, there's no way for new microorganisms to come in. And so this will prevent spoilage, because there's no organisms that are speeding along the spoiling process. And this comes from a view of creation. It comes from the idea of creation. And so it's basically what I call this applied creation science. Newton's physics. Most people don't recognize that this actually came from theological ideas. Today we think of Newtonian physics as kind of the paradigm of good science. But interestingly, at the time that it was proposed, the biggest criticism of it was that it was too supernatural. So the way to think about this is that at the time, they thought that the only types of science that was allowed because was science that dealt with physical interactions. So that they actually had a pretty strong split between the idea of science and theology at the time, and they tried to explain everything in terms of physical interactions between things. But Newton came along and said, no, God can cause any sort of causation that he wants. God can make things interact at a distance because it's God that upholds all things. We don't have to depend on matter to be doing all the work. So God's omnipresence can allow causation to act at a distance. And so so it was the prior generation's hardened stance that everything should be mechanical that prevented them from discovering non-mechanical causes such as gravity. But Newton threw that off. He's like, I don't have to presuppose that every cause is a mechanical cause. I can, God, since he upholds all things, any type of cause-effect relationship I can deduce can be real because God's omnipresence allows for it. Leibniz, who is the co-founder of calculus, complained that for gravity to act at a distance should disqualify it as science because such effects were supernatural. Experimental biology actually came from the defense of creation. What's considered the first biology experiment is Francesco Redi's experiment with whether maggots come from meat or whether they are just born on meat. And this is oftentimes mentioned in textbooks, but what they fail to mention is that the motivation for his experiment was theology. And so this is taken from his book that describes the experiments. He says, I shall express my belief that the earth, after having brought forth the first plants and animals at the beginning by order of the supreme and omnipotent creator, has never since produced any kinds of plants or animals, either perfect or imperfect, and everything which we know in past or present times that she has produced came solely from the true seeds of the plants and animals themselves, which thus, through means of their own, preserve their species. So the beginning of experimental biology was in an effort to show the truth of the Genesis account of creation. Genetics likewise came from a very similar founding. Everybody today is familiar with genetics, at least in general, but few people know about its origins. When it was first proposed, Gregor Mendel explicitly proposed it as a refutation of evolution in favor of permanent types of being as expressed through the Bible. Mendel's idea was that if there were fixed sets of traits with specific variations, what evolutionists had referred to as new species, that they were actually just rearrangements of existing heritable material. So if you think about the way that genetics works, you have genes shuffling and reintermixing. And what Mendel said is that all of these changes that supposedly produce new species are actually just rearrangements of existing genes. And then Mendel's ideas actually were ignored, probably because of the heavy interest in evolution that came out with the origin of species. And they were only reintroduced into biology after someone figured out how to justify it under evolution. So they basically ignored Mendel for 50 years because they couldn't bring it into alignment with evolution. So so this is what Mendel actually said. And I kind of have a simplified version at the bottom. I'm not going to read you the top one because it's a little complicated and deals in little confusingly worded. So I have my own wording of it. And so basically, he says that Gartner, who was a creation biologist, opposed evolution because he was able to transform species back and forth by breeding. So if you can transform something back and forth, it hasn't really changed. There's not a fundamentally new type if you can go to one species and then back to the other. This ability to transform back and forth, and Mendel's paper described the mechanism for how that worked, while not 100% proof, is really good evidence for this idea of fixed boundaries beyond which organisms cannot evolve into fundamentally different types. So this is the conclusion of Mendel's paper that describes the first paper describing genetics. And so we can see that the foundation of genetics is actually based on preserving a genesis idea of basic kinds and types. The Big Bang Theory. So not everyone agrees with the Big Bang Theory, but it is interesting to know that it's the foundation for a lot of modern science, and it's interesting to know that it was actually had theological foundations. It was developed by a priest, Lemaitre, and it basically converted science from a position where they believed in steady state theory, that the universe was eternal, that it had an eternal past, to one that had a finite origin. In other words, the universe had a creation event. Now, in public, Lemaitre was always careful to separate his science and theology, but his non-published writings and his private conversations showed that the goal of the Big Bang Theory was concordism between cosmology and Catholic doctrine. So one of the old astrophysicists, I think it's Hannes Alfven, he says, "I was there when Lemaitre first proposed this theory." He said the motivation for the theory was Lemaitre's need to reconcile his physics with the church's doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And so you have, from the people that he first interacted with, they point out that what Lemaitre was trying to do was reconcile cosmology with creation in the Bible. And then more recently, artificial intelligence. So Peter Thiel, who's one of the co-founders of PayPal, has this great book, 0 to 1. And it's really interesting because it's kind of, he doesn't explicitly talk about this, but it's kind of, if you imagine a theology applied to business, that's really what it is. It's 0 to 1, notes on startups or how to build the future. And here's what he says. It says, computers are far more different from people than any two people are from each other. Men and machines are fundamentally different things. People have intentionality. We form plans and make decisions in complicated situations. We're less good at making sense of enormous amounts of data. Computers are exactly the opposite. They excel at efficient data processing, but they struggle to make basic judgments that would be simple for any human. In 2012, one of Google's supercomputers made headlines when, after scanning 10 million thumbnails of YouTube videos, it learned to identify a cat with 75% accuracy. That seems impressive until you remember that an average 4-year-old can do it flawlessly. When a cheap laptop beats the smartest mathematicians at some tasks, but even a supercomputer with 16,000 CPUs can't beat a child at others, you can tell that humans and computers are not just more or less powerful than each other, they are categorically different. So this brings into focus kind of the theology of humanity, that humans are not just machines, that there's something different about humans, that we have a body, soul, and spirit. And so, so here you have, in the very nature of AI, we're showing that this separation. In fact, most people don't recognize that computers themselves actually arose from a philosophical / theological discussion about the nature of reality and explanation. I'm not going to go into that because that would take a good long time even to describe what this setup was. But nonetheless, it's really interesting that computers were actually built not to solve technical problems, but actually to solve a philosophical problem. And it's important to note that there's a big gulf between AI as it exists in real life and AI as it's shown in popular media. AI as it's practiced in real life assumes that humans and computers are fundamentally different. Humans bring the intuition, they bring the judgment, and they parameterize problems. They say, this problem has this, the solution should kind of look like this. And then AI, it processes loads of data very quickly. And so this is kind of the setup for most artificial intelligence processes. This is how the work is divvied up. And there's also several technologies that are based on this separation between the capabilities of human and machines. It's the field known as human computation. And one of the outgrowths of it are what are known as CAPTCHAs. So if you've ever been to those websites where they want you to type in letters that are kind of skewed around, or they want you to identify, want you to identify something in a picture. These sorts of things are meant to make sure that there is a human at the console. And so they've identified tasks that humans do very simply that computers essentially can't do, or at least can't do in an efficient manner. And so this idea, so the only reason that that's possible is because there's a difference between how computers do things and how humans do things. And as I said, this is in alignment with the theological view of humanity and against the materialistic view of humans as just being basically meat robots. So there's actually a blog, if you're interested in this idea, mindmatters.ai. So not mindmatters.com, but mindmatters.ai. And it is a website dealing with news, editorials, and whatnot that deal a lot with the question of natural intelligence and artificial intelligence. And I write for this blog a lot myself. So, so in summary, science and theology both aim at truth, and we should expect them to always eventually meet up, even if it isn't occurring right now at every point. History is littered with little minor concordisms that one society thought were important and were discarded in the next. I didn't go over a lot of those just because they're relatively unimportant. But where theology and science seem to work together best is when theology suggests big ideas for science to work through. So that's what we just went through a lot of those examples, is that theology wasn't dictating little minor details of science, but theology was providing a framework for understanding reality, and then science was working through the details after that. Theology and science should be free to each work independently, but we should also celebrate when there's interdisciplinary work that brings them together. But we shouldn't expect that any idea, any current idea in science, theology, or their combination is the final and total truth. These are fields that are both in progress, and we should expect both of them to make mistakes along the way, and that's just fine. So anyway, so that is science and theology and kind of my view of their relationship.